be away for a few days. So, I was just thinking about what a big week this has been for the Biden administration, Harris administration. Obviously, maybe one of the biggest of their administration, and yet it's so. Therefore, it's very easy to forget that when because we've had such a sea change at the top, that actually, if you look back on November. We got the big one, but down ballot didn't go quite as we had hoped. So I think that it's really important that we continue to remember that and to continue to think about why that happened and what we can learn from it. So we're really thrilled today to be joined by a great friend and collaborator of ours, many of whom you know, Matt Bennett. Third Way commissioned a report that was called exactly that, What Happened Down Ballot, along with the Collective PAC and the Latino Victory Fund. And it's super fascinating. So I'm really happy to have him here to walk us through it. I won't steal any of his top lines, but I will tell you that the New York Times called this probably the most soul searching done by either party since the election. So congrats to them on this really deep dive in the report with some really important takeaways. So Matt's going to run us through a slide deck, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for people to ask him some questions. So Matt, as always, thanks for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Debbie, and always great to be here. I'm going to share my screen here and try to get to the right. In a minute. There we go. As Debbie noted, we commissioned right after the election. Our feeling was it didn't go as well as we'd hoped down ballot. We did not look at the state and local races, which obviously are the central concern to most New Dealers, but we did look at mostly House and some Senate races. And I think the findings will resonate with people on this call about what was happening in the states as well. Obviously, the state legislative races in particular were a huge disappointment. So while it's not a post-mortem because nobody died, I mean, we ended up with the White House and both majorities, it is a retrospective and as the Times noted, a pretty searching one. It involved 6 months of work. We hired two veteran Democratic strategists, Linda Tran and Marlon Marshall. They had a team of about 10 people that worked for 6 months. They did 142 interviews with candidates and consultants and heads of NGOs and allies. They looked at reams of data, hundreds and hundreds of ads, and came to a series of conclusions about what we think actually happened in 2020. We looked closely at 37 key races, some wins, some losses. We tried to spread them around the country and make sure that we were representing areas that were diverse demographically, geographically, and otherwise. And this is, we think, the deepest dive into what happened in an election, probably since the Republicans did it in 2012, and theirs was a postmortem because that was after the Romney loss for them. They, of course, concluded famously that what they needed to do was be better at doing outreach to Latinos, and then they promptly nominated Donald Trump. So we're hoping to have a little more impact with this than they did. But we did this alongside Collective PAC and Latino Victory as the outside groups, and then we worked very closely in Congress with the New Democrats, who are very close allies of ours and of the New Deal, and with the Tri-Caucus, the Hispanic Caucus, Black Caucus, and the Asian Pacific Island Caucus. We were kind of consulting with them all the way along, and it was a really great collaboration. And what we found is that what we concluded in this report has gained fairly wide currency inside the party. We've talked to Jamie Harrison, we've talked to the committees, and they all seem fairly persuaded by our findings. So 6 major findings. By the way, the final deck was 450 slides long. I'm not going to do that one for you today. I'm going to do one that is much shorter, but I will take you through the 6 big findings. The first is that voters of color, and all voters of color, not just Latinos, are persuasion voters, and we cannot continue, as Democrats, we cannot continue to treat them as if they're just base voters who need to be mobilized. And really, that's how we did it. Voters of color were basically GOTV targets. And that meant that the modeling and the polling and the campaign decisions that went into all of that regarded them only as turnout targets and not as voters who needed to be moved to vote for Democrats. And that just didn't work. It didn't take into account regional differences, didn't take into account ethnic differences within those communities, and or sex and age differences and class differences within the communities. And that's a serious problem. Just two examples of how this happened. In Florida 26, Democratic support among Latino in Latino precincts was down by 12 points from 2016. 12, which is just a giant drop off. And in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas 23, we were down 7 points in Latino precincts from 2016. So those can be determinative numbers, and we've got to make sure we understand that why Latino turnout, why Latino performance was dropping for Democrats. There are some really serious red flags in the numbers showing Democrats losing ground. Debbie McCarcel-Powell in South Florida lost a race where Republicans were up by 13 points with new Latino voters. That surge of Latino voters in South Florida really hurt Debbie. It hurt Donna Shalala. We were down 8 points from where we were in 2016 overall with Latino voters in those areas. With Black voters, no question, we saw a huge surge in Black voters. The problem is there was a bigger surge among white voters. And we also lost a little bit of ground with African-American voters. They were, without a doubt, crucial to winning, most obviously in the Georgia Senate runoffs. And in the November election, they did turn out in huge numbers, but again, white voters outpaced that. And we lost a little bit of ground with Black voters. We saw modest dips in the share of Black support in some key races. So in North Carolina, in the Senate race, Republicans did pick up some ground among Black supporters, particularly outside of the cities, in suburbs, exurbs, and rural communities. We also lost support in Black precincts in Virginia 7, Abigail Spanberger's district. Even though turnout in those areas was up relative to 2016, we lost ground in the overall share. And then among AAPI voters, the situation was a lot like it was for Latinos. First of all, there was an incredible surge in AAPI turnout. It was up 47% from 2016. That is compared to a 12% increase among other voters, so 47 to 12. But API voters are most assuredly not monolithic. There is a huge difference between Vietnamese and Filipino and Chinese Americans and every other ethnic group. There's a difference between those who have been here for one generation or longer, and we have to start treating them that way. And what we found was the congressional candidates underperformed the top of the ticket with AAPI voters. In Texas 24, which is in the Dallas-Fort Worth suburbs, Candace Valenzuela, our candidate there, underperformed Biden by 4 points. That was the difference in her race in districts that were heavily AAPI. In California 39, Congressman Cisneros underperformed Biden by 9 points. That is just a massive underperformance in a district where AAPI voters made up a quarter of all the voters and a third of all the new voters. So we have got to pay more attention to AAPI voters. Second, and this is a thing that has been an obsession for me and for Third Way and for our new organization, Shield PAC, Republicans' attempts to brand Democrats as radicals, it worked. Message mattered. So when they called our candidates, no matter who they were, radical socialists who want to defund the police and open the border and ban fracking, those things really took a toll, especially in places, pardon me, where law and order and socialism were a constant theme in Republican ads. They hurt, and they hurt not just with white voters. It is true, of course, that defund the police was a racist dog whistle. I mean, it wasn't even a dog whistle, it was like a klaxon. But it also is true that those defund the police ads hurt us with voters of color because they are sensitive to rising crime rates. They didn't like the idea of defund the police either, outside of some very, very blue areas. And and it really, really had an impact. And the socialism charge hurt everywhere. It hurt, Ben McAdams running in Salt Lake City, and it hurt Debbie McCarcel-Powell running in South Florida with very different demographics, but similar results. We saw a bunch of the ads were very direct. Xochitl Small was a socialist. Jared Golden was wanting to do all sorts of terrible things. These were very moderate candidates, but the attacks really, really stuck. And again, some of the districts where kind of that law and order thing was particularly prevalent saw a larger share of voters of color supporting Republicans. So the numbers bear out the warning signs, especially in these communities of color. Districts like this saw a higher share of Latino, API, Black voters supporting Republicans than in other districts. And in particular, what we found was, keep in mind, in the House races, we lost 14 House seats in 2020. One was Colin Peterson. One was Loebsack, who retired, and we lost that seat by 6 votes. The 12 others were the class of 2018. They were freshmen. And for the most part, they didn't have a deep enough bio awareness in their district. People just didn't know who they were and what they stood for. And that's why they so underperformed Biden, where people did know that Joe Biden was not a socialist, that Joe Biden did not want to defund the police. They just weren't sure if that was true or not when they were hearing this onslaught of lies about people like Anthony Brindisi in upstate New York. When you tell people in Utica that someone wants to defund the police, that is a potent attack, even if it's complete malarkey, which it was. And Anthony lost by 109 votes in that district. Number 3, this is not surprising to anyone, but it is worth noting, polling, huge problem. Even after 2016, in 2016, we thought there were shy Trump voters who were embarrassed to tell pollsters that they were supporting this jerk. Turns out that's not the thing. Trump voters are not shy at all. They're super proud of being Trump voters. The problem is they just don't talk to pollsters. They don't answer the phone. They don't go through the polls. And our polling was terrible. It was way, way off. And it had huge implications for how we made decisions about where to invest and how to think about these races. And we saw over and over again that the polling that these campaigns were getting, even right before the election, was off by around 10 points. If your polling is up by 10 points, you are lost. And that's where a lot of these candidates found themselves. Cameron Webb was told by his pollsters that he was up by 3 in October, and he ended up losing by 6. There's your 10-point swing. Abigail Spanberger was told that her gap was that she had a 12-point lead in a proprietary poll that she did in October, and she won by 2. Again, a 10-point swing. Ron Kind was told that he was up by 13, which would have been his biggest win of all time. His campaign didn't believe it, thankfully, and he won by 3. So this 10-point gap is not sustainable. That is leading to some very, very bad decisions, and it really, really hurt. Another finding, not surprising at all, COVID changed everything. That's obvious, but it was interesting the ways in which it changed everything. There was one upside, which is that our candidates were able to raise money like this, which is a pretty easy way to raise money. They can do it by Zoom. But the cons, some of which were clear, you couldn't go door to door, meant that you couldn't do a normal turnout operation, but it also meant that you didn't have your finger on the pulse of your district in ways that you might have if you'd had canvassers out there. And that meant that those 10-point gaps that we were seeing in the polling nobody could figure out if they were true or not. Nobody even had a gut instinct about it because we didn't have people on the doors. And it was able to give Republicans another opportunity to frame Democrats wanting to shut down the economy, something that really did hurt Democrats in the long run. 5, this is some good news, or can be good news. Year-round organizing definitely works. Cross-party collaboration was better this time. Long-term investments produce results. We saw this most clearly, of course, with Stacey Abrams and the Georgia runoff. And it definitely worked in places where there had been a deep commitment to year-round organizing. But it worked for Republicans also. The Libre project in South Florida and South Texas definitely helped Republicans turn out Latino voters in those districts. And as we heard many times from many different folks, this is not a sidelight. This is the main course. We have got to do a better job of investing in long-term turnout, long-term grassroots mobilization. Finally, we just concluded that our hopes were too high for 2018. Really, there were two big reasons for that, or maybe three. One is we assumed the electorate would look like it did in 2018. We shouldn't have assumed that. It almost never does. The midterm electorate does not look like the presidential year electorate, and it especially doesn't look that way when somebody as polarizing as Trump is on the ticket. And so we convinced ourselves that we were going to be able to win in places where we just weren't able to win. Second, we assumed first-time voters would be Democrats. That was false. I mean, we saw that again over and over and over, particularly with voters of color who we thought the surge in turnout would be great, and it turned out to be very, very bad. And then finally, bad polling just had us chasing the wrong ball and thinking things were much rosier than they were. As one person put it, we always think turnout's up. That's good for us. It just isn't. It just means the turnout is up, and we got to make sure we know who's being turned out. So with that, why don't I stop sharing my screen, and would love to hear from you all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Matt. As always, incredibly thoughtful and super helpful. So let me open it up. I've got questions, but let me see who else does. Maybe just with the flag and with your hand, if you want to start the bidding. Hey, Nelson, how are you?
Hi, good afternoon.
Good to see you.
Thank you for the invitation. I'll throw out a question. Matt, it's nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
Full disclosure, Matt and I spent a lot of time in Florida in 2000. And I say that because it's sad that some of the lessons haven't been learned, it seems. But I wonder if you can contextualize it, and just by way of background, it's very nice to meet other folks and see other old friends. And I appreciate the work you're doing. I serve as chair-elect of the board of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber. I also been working in energy for the last 15 years, but prior to that, I worked in the Clinton administration, originally born in Cuba. So that district is a district where I grew up for many years. And it really is frustrating. Those lessons do not seem to be learned. I guess my quick question is, one, do you see any learnings right now? And then also maybe you can contextualize that with the current kind of environment we have, and specifically with, let's say, infrastructure. Is that, do you see deals getting done or not? So I'd love your thoughts on that. And thank you, Debbie, for the great work that you all are doing.
Nelson, great to see you again, and thank you for those questions. On the first question, are people, is our students learning, as George Bush would say? The answer is yes. We do think that there's these findings were pretty close to the findings that the DCCC came to in their own assessment of this. And we have gotten some very positive response from every level of the party. I think people really understand that what we say happened. The thing that worries us the most, though, is it is very clear what we need to do to respond to the same attacks that they leveled last time, which are coming again already. I mean, they worked really well. They picked up 14 seats. Why wouldn't they just do it again? They're doing it again. They're calling us socialists. They're trying to make defund a thing. Now it's going to be critical race theory or something else. But they're going to level the charge that our vulnerable swing district Democrats are radicals in some way. And there are two ways to push back on that. Three. One, Democrats are going to do, they always do. One is to say, no, you're the radicals, right? That is what DCCC and House Majority PAC are going to do. And on the Senate side, those committees. They're going to say, you are the January 6th insurrectionists, you're the party of Marjorie Taylor Greene, you're the nutcases. And I think that's a pretty good strategy. But that's offense. We also really, really need defense. And by defense, what I mean is two things. One is, again, we need more connection between these members and their districts. People have to be better known. They have to have higher brand awareness in their own districts. And we need an economic narrative that resonates. On the first thing, we started Shield PAC to try to help create better brand awareness for those Democrats in those districts. So we're going to be in there early, trying to, tell the people of those districts who they are, so that when the attacks come, they kind of bounce off the way they bounced off Joe Biden. And then the second thing around the economic narrative goes to your second question, which is, I think we have an enormous opportunity here to tell a story to voters about what Democrats are doing for them. The Recovery Act alone is $2 trillion. I mean, it is like maybe the biggest, by money, the biggest bill ever passed. And we need to do a much better job of weaving that into a story about how that's changing people's lives. And we'll have a huge opportunity to do the same if we get a bipartisan bill and a reconciliation package that moves the ball even farther. But we're not great at that as Democrats. I will never forget, we did an event where Senator Casey came and talked to us, and he said, the day after we passed the ACA, I went down to the floor the next day, and we were talking about Dodd-Frank. And, we had just passed the biggest expansion of healthcare coverage since Medicare, and we're on to the next thing. And we cannot do that. We have got to make sure that we consolidate the gains by creating an economic narrative that resonates deeply. So,
thanks, Matt. And I will say to that point, I completely agree with your last point. And for those on the call, just for your awareness, New Deal, that's part of what New Deal is really spending our time on right now, is trying to make sure that the stories of the way that this money is being spent out in the states is front and center of the narrative. I think that's super important. And I see, Rob, you've got your hand up. Let me just ask one follow-up question though before I go to a different topic, which is, do you think that how do you think Biden not, being a moderate, Biden being at the top of our party influences that radical charge? Is that going to help us, or how do we take best advantage of it?
I think it helps us enormously. But we have to make sure that we consolidate our gains appropriately. So they can't lay a glove on him. They cannot figure out how to attack Joe Biden. It's unbelievable. I mean, they have just not cracked that nut. And the reason is because he has this incredibly powerful personal brand, that he is a moderate, he is like them, he is like voters, he understands their lives. The story that he tells over and over about his dad making the longest walk up those stairs, he's an incredibly relatable politician. And that is hugely important, but is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. What our candidates, I think, at every level ought to do is hug Joe Biden as tightly as they possibly can. And they need to create their own narrative that is similar to his. And just for example, Abigail Spanberger was able to tell a story about her own service in the CIA and her father's service in the military that really created an emotional connection for her voters. Other candidates, and I'm not casting any aspersions, I mean, some of these districts were just too hard. We couldn't hang on to some of them, but some of them were unable to kind of get that emotional connection the way that Biden did, the way that Spanberger did. And those are the things we've got to really work on.
Thank you. All right, we'll go to Rob and then we'll go to Claude. So Rob.
All right. Thanks. So good to see you, Matt.
Good to see you, Rob.
Two-part question. What beyond what's being done now in terms of communicating the benefits of everything that the administration is trying to do, from the Recovery Act, American Jobs Plan, these things, what specifically needs to be done in terms of making sure that communication can pierce everything else that's going on? And then two, on the polling, what's the prescription in terms of getting more accurate polling methodologies?
Oh, those are two very hard questions, Rob, but I will do my best. Look, I mean, as you know, you're going to have a very hot Senate race in New Hampshire. You're going to have a very difficult House race when they gerrymander the hell out of the districts up there. And so you'll kind of be at ground zero for this in 2022. And so I think what we need to do is make sure that that our candidates are more aligned than Democrats generally are. It doesn't mean they have to be saying the same thing as every single Democrat. Like the squad is not going to sound like, you know, Jean Shaheen or Maggie Hassan, but I think we need to have a kind of central economic story that we're telling, led by the White House. I think they're doing a reasonably good job of that. They brought Gene Sperling in to kind of run the Recovery Act in and make sure that people know about it. And that has to be an ongoing effort that continues for 18 months. I mean, we're only 3 months into the Recovery Act at the moment, and now it already seems like ancient history. And we got to make sure that we keep it front and center for people, and that we do the same on these other bills if they end up passing. And that most importantly, we are reminding people every day of precisely how this impacts their lives, because we do a terrible job. We often remain in the abstract when we need to be in the concrete. And as Claude's heard me say many times, anecdote beats data every time. So we've got to tell stories about how this has impacted New Hampshire or Concord, New Hampshire, or somebody's family. And I think we can, but it's going to take real effort. On the polling question, there's a consortium of pollsters, Democratic pollsters, who've come together and have put out a couple of reports on this. And the bottom line is they don't know yet. They have not cracked this nut. The likelihood is, I believe we're going to have to move towards qualitative testing, where we are getting an impression of what is landing for voters out there, and not rely as much on quantitative, particularly quantitative horse race polling, because I just don't think it's going to be reliable enough to rely on. What that means is they're going to have to run as if they're behind all the time, and do all the things you do if you're 5 points behind. And so I think that would be better in the long run for our campaigns, but I don't know that there's an easy or even hard fix for the problems that are facing polling right now.
Thanks. Claude?
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks for this fantastic program. Third Way and New Deal are like peanut butter and chocolate. They're each great separately, but they're super awesome together. So thank you. My question for you is this issue of personal branding, which you invoked, Joe Biden and Abigail Spanberger. A lot of our fellow travelers have succeeded in tough circumstances, and Ron kind of one, by developing a really strong personal brand. So all of the sort of messaging and strategy you're talking about are probably the most important thing overall for Democrats in the country. But in many districts, in many states, you just can't win without a strong personal brand that is distanced from any part of the party. Can you talk to that a little bit, and how we, how someone like a Ben McAdams, for example, might be able to do that in a state, in Utah, in a district like his?
Yeah, and Claude, I couldn't agree more with that. That is exactly right. It's the reason that Ron survived. Even though she's leaving, Sherry Bustos was able to survive. Her vote share dropped by 17 points from 2018 to 2020, and she ended up winning by just over 3 points, which is pretty close for her. And one of the reasons, so there were two big things. One is, despite the fact that the attacks on her seemed stupid and ridiculous, she was accused of wanting to defund the police when her husband is the sheriff of the largest county in her district. And so it would be easy to dismiss that as idiotic, but she didn't, because she understood the power of that narrative and she took it very seriously. So I think the two sides to the coin are: one, do not ever dismiss the attacks as frivolous, no matter how silly they seem. I'm not saying either of them did this, but Debbie McCarcel-Powell and Donna Shalala were both hit with the socialist attack. Debbie fled socialism as a child. Donna served for 8 years in the Clinton administration. So both of them could have been forgiven to say, are you insane? Are you calling me a socialist? But you have to take these attacks very seriously because they can really land, particularly on members who don't have long records of service in their districts and deep connections the way that Ron does. Second thing is you've got to spend money, and you've got to spend money early, which is to say, as soon as the districts are known, starting next year, probably March or April, we have to be in those districts doing things. So by we, I mean Shield PAC should be doing them. I think HMP and the D-Trip should be doing them, and at whatever level race you're running, those outside organizations and the campaigns themselves should be doing a lot of positive bio stuff, even though there is just this trope in politics that early money is wasted. Our view and what we heard in the retrospective is that's just not true. That particularly building bio in your district can be enormously effective in fending off attacks. And we don't know what the attacks are going to be. The defund the police attack didn't develop until August. And so we're not exactly sure what they're going to come with, but it's going to be something, and you'll be able to survive it if the voters know who you are.
Thanks.
David, make sure you
Hi.
introduce yourself for everyone, please, too. Sorry, David, go ahead.
Hi, David Buckle from suburban New York. I want to ask Matt, so to peel back at least one layer on the sense that everyone in the party has been receptive to this. I want to understand a little bit more, if I could, what the reaction has been, or what you feel it has been from the, I don't like calling it the progressive wing of the party, because I sell myself a progressive Democrat, but the folks who don't really necessarily come to the table identifying with the party as party, whether that's the folks who actually were in some form or another in support of defund the police, or folks more nowadays who are saying maybe that President Biden isn't moving fast enough on a number of key issues, core issues that maybe all Democrats believe in, but that for whom, they're more interested in, say, attacking Joe Manchin than Mitch McConnell. In other words, that poll both within the party, but also within the narrative, Republicans to some extent wouldn't have been able to latch on to certain attacks were it not for the fact that it's demonstrably true that with regards to some folks, and not just activists, some candidates and otherwise, these were guiding principles for them. So maybe a little less as it relates to election 2020, but as it relates to the current dynamic, have you seen any reaction to your report, and what do you think are the ways to address resistance to what you've seen, if you're experienced some?
So that's exactly right. The reason they were able to make the socialist charge stick is because we spent 18 months coming very close to nominating somebody who's a socialist to be the Democratic nominee for president. I mean, that's just true. And the highest profile member of the Democratic House Conference who is not in leadership, who has 12.5 million Twitter followers, identifies as a socialist. Contrast that to Xochitl Torres-Small, who running in a southern New Mexico district had 24,000 Twitter followers, who is not on Maddo every night, who is not nearly as, doesn't have nearly the megaphone that others in the party have. So your question, to answer your question, the folks like the Squad and Bernie don't agree with our conclusions, but they've been relatively muted in their response, in part because we were allied with Collective PAC and Latino Victory, because we had Marlon and Linda running this for us. It's pretty hard for them to attack us as, a bunch of third way moderates who are just, trying to promote our own point of view. And what we heard comported with what the DCCC concluded. And so there was pretty broad, not unanimity, but there was a pretty substantial majority of the party came to similar conclusions. That said, Congresswoman Omar was on Morning Joe a few weeks ago saying that we should dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department. So like this isn't going away entirely. And the debate will continue inside the party, and it will continue to give Republicans enough oxygen to make these attacks attached to other Democrats, which is why we have to be so aggressive in responding to them.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I will say too that, you know, we get this all the time, as you won't be surprised, from our leaders who say around the country, particularly in, you know, Trump districts, you know, they just feel like they have to run against the party all the time. And it's, you know, it's a real problem for us long-term to keep these majorities. So let me go to Loran was chatting with me, Loran in Florida. Let me turn it over to you. Oops, you're on mute though.
Okay. Hey, Matt, Loran Osley, state senator in Florida. And you've described our scenario pretty well down here. So, and I think you mentioned this a little bit. I sort of feel like the third rail, the defund police, the socialism is, they're lining up pretty strong behind the critical race theory. You know, we've seen DeSantis already move in that direction and start creating this division on those issues. What do you think about that, and what should we be doing about that?
Yeah, I think that is possibly going to be the thing that emerges as the next big thing. Some of the air has gone out of the balloon for defund the police, in part because there just hasn't been any new horrifying videos of police murdering innocent people. The activists have not been in the streets, and the call to defund the police has quieted to some extent. That could change in an instant, of course, and we could be right back where we were. That combined with the fact that homicide rates are rising. Other crime actually isn't, but homicides are going up in big cities, and you get results like you just got in New York City, where Adams won the primary in part because he was, you know, going to be tough on crime, or tougher than his opponent. So it is possible that crime is receding, but could come back. Critical race theory, which I cannot believe, having talked about this in law school 30 years ago, that this is like a thing in politics, is shocking to me. But the Republicans and their allies, particularly at Fox, have done a really effective job of turning this into something, and basically making the claim that Democrats and progressives hate white people and hate America. And if that perception takes hold among voters, then we will lose widely in 2022. But I think we have plenty of time to push back on. It's such obvious nonsense that we have a lot of time to make sure that we're pushing back on it. And we need to be clear about where we draw lines, where we do believe that racism is real. We do believe that there are serious racial inequities that government must address, but we don't believe some of the more bizarre things that they're touting, from the San Francisco School Board or some crazy, university subcommittee that they're kind of implying is what the Democratic platform is around race. And I think we have to be very clear about that, and we have to follow the example that Biden used during the campaign, when he simply stated without equivocation, I do not believe we should defund the police. That is a bad idea. And we just have to be unequivocal about it if we're going to push this off.
Anyone else want to show me a hand, or? Claude, you want to go? You got another one, Claude?
Sure, in the absence of anyone else popping up with a question. So as a, as a pro-growth progressive, I don't watch Rachel Maddow, but I do read the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal because I want to know what the other side is thinking. And on critical race theory, what I see the right focusing on is not actually the substance of critical race theory.
No.
What they're attacking is truly crazy behavior, largely at universities.
Right.
That is just, would be unacceptable to 90% of the American population. And unfortunately, these aren't isolated incidents. They're all over the place, and that is a real issue. That's not a made-up issue. So how do we take that? I mean, it's a real issue, not in the sense that it's pervasive. It's a real issue in the sense that these things are popping up all over the country all the time, and it's not limited to San Francisco State University. It's Stanford and leading universities. So how do we distance ourselves from that?
Yeah, great question. It's everywhere. I mean, I don't know if you saw yesterday, there was a thing moving around on social media. Brandeis has a list of words you're not supposed to use and phrases, including picnic. You're not allowed to use the word picnic. And I get it, picnic was kind of a code word for back in the terrible days of Jim Crow when people would go and watch lynchings, which is horrible, but telling people they can't use the word picnic is insane. And we've got to be very clear about that. And during the 2020 primaries, third way before Jim Carville got there, we were saying we got to avoid faculty lounge debates. And we thought the debate over Medicare for all was a faculty lounge debate. We're not going to spend $33 trillion to have Medicare for all. That is not going to happen. Why are we talking about that? And we have got to do the same thing to distance ourselves from the bizarro world of academia that my dad spent 60 years in. So I feel close to, but it is very toxic politically, and we got to be super clear about that.
Thanks.
Show me a hand or use your hand button if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, I'm going to.
So Debbie, can I come back in on that?
Yeah, please.
No, I mean, so that on one hand, I hear what you're saying. On the other hand, I live in a state where DeSantis he is defining. Can you not hear me?
No, you're okay.
He's defining critical race. Yeah. He's defining it as, a teacher who has a Black Lives Matter in their classroom, and that's the definition that they're showing out to their base. So they're creating the ground, and I don't know, they're setting up the battle lines, I guess. And we've got to be really careful where we fall on that. I mean, the examples you gave are, understandable. That's what some will go to. But when I have my governor saying that it's not okay to have a Black Lives Matter poster and using that as an example, I don't know how we respond to that.
That's such a good point, because these things are extraordinarily delicate, particularly, let's just face it, for white candidates and white operatives. It's very dangerous. After the election, you may recall, there was a back and forth in the New York Times between Spamberger and Connor Lamb on the one hand and AOC on the other. And Ocasio-Cortez accused the two of them of racism for saying that defund the police hurt, even though that was just factually accurate. That is a very scary charge to be leveled, and they immediately backed off for obvious reasons. So it is extremely difficult to draw the lines where they need to be drawn. And I think, to your point, this debate's going to play out differently in different places. DeSantis is a particularly skilled practitioner of this dark art. And I think Florida is going to be a really tough place to fight this battle. Others are not skilled at it, and they're going to be much more, they're going to do it in a much more ham-handed way. But honestly, I don't know the answer to what to say about having a Black Lives Matter poster. I think you can make a very strong argument that you should stand up and defend the proposition that Black Lives Matter is a movement that is important and making deeply and vitally important case. But you then have to push back on the idea that the BLM protesters were the ones who were violent. And then you're into a debate that's on their turf. So it's incredibly tricky. We're going to be doing a lot of research on this over the course of the next 6 months, and we would be happy to come back if Debbie wants us to and share it with you all. But we're looking at this really carefully. I don't know the answer yet.
Let me let Mayor Reed hop in here. I see a hand, Mayor.
Hey, Debbie. Hey, Matt. Thank y'all for pulling this together. I'm going to speak out of turn because as mayor, we run nonpartisan, but obviously people aren't. And I'm one of those people who's very partisan, so it doesn't matter about the race itself. Let me just share something that I think is very important. One, I'm glad that you guys partner with Quentin James and Stephanie in the Collective PAC. They're very supportive of me in my run for mayor, and I think they do a great thing around the country on identifying candidates that often go overlooked, if you will, and underfunded at the peril of our party. But I want to say that I think Democrats, in particular, spend too much time playing defense. I think Democrats spend too much time in the weeds and really trying to figure out how not to offend. And that's why we lose consistently. And I understand the data, but you have to understand who the base of the Democratic Party is. And I know that depends on what part of the country you're in. But I think one thing that the Republicans do better than anybody is they understand their base. And they play to their base, and they whip that base into the emotional frenzy that will allow them to think they can run through a wall. And we often don't do that. And we get in these white paper discussions that, quite frankly, don't play out to the average person who doesn't watch MSNBC, who doesn't watch CNN, and is trying to get by, just barely off of their second job if they are going to that second that third part-time job they have. So when we're thinking about who our base is, we have to be concise and we have to be very deliberate and intentional of identifying it where it is. We understand that we're running uphill because of how the districts have been gerrymandered by Republican-led legislatures. We've been doing that since 2010. So I think that the goals that we have achieved have been really a lesson for all of us to understand how we've won some of these seats, even if we lost them, 2 years later. I was part of a campaign in 2008 where the previous mayor, Montgomery, then ran and switched. He flipped a Republican seat that had been Republican for 30 years on the coattails of President Obama, got in, distanced himself from President Obama, and then thought that he could play more toward the Republicans, if you will, and lost to a city councilwoman who had been here for just 4 years. That was Martha Roby. Martha held that seat for 10 years in our second congressional district here in Alabama. And it was one that he didn't understand his base is where I'm going. And so I think when people get into the Black Lives Matter issue, that's a red herring. If that doesn't impact your base and your vote, let's not get into that trap. But to the degree you have to address it, then my pushback would be on the very people who are calling Black Lives Matter activists everything under the sun are people you're probably not going to get anyway. Second of all, they are people who would have called Dr. King and many, John Lewis and many others, members of the civil rights movement, under the same name, and in fact did. So we can't play to that. You have to get the people that believe in what we stand for and believe in the cause of what government can do itself to help people get a hand up, if you will, not a handout, that can get a opportunity for an equitable chance to succeed and to achieve the American dream. As long as we're playing passive, as long as we're allowing the Republicans to dictate the terms of the argument, they're going to win the argument. We have to dictate the terms of the argument, and we have to make sure that we aren't worried about who's going to be offended, who's not going to like us, because guess what? That person that's offended is not going to like us, isn't going to vote for you anyway. If you're speaking truth, you're speaking to your principles and your values, people see that, people are attached to that, people come out and vote who don't vote otherwise. If we come with kind of cookie cutter responses to what we think the Republicans are going to say about us, that doesn't get our base. That doesn't get people of color, doesn't get young people, progressive, centrist, moderates, whatever it is you want to call us. It doesn't get the people that we need to the polls. And I don't believe that it's going to attract the independents who really want to see work done. And I think that the party and the Biden administration so far is doing that. What we have to do is point to that. And we have to claim that. And I think kind of Matt said that a little earlier, is claim that as our own. As a mayor, I can tell you, without COVID relief, without the vaccines, without the American Rescue Plan, we aren't having discussions about people arguing over who's going to get on a cruise, or arguing about who's going to go to a state park, or who's going to go, when we're going to go back to school. We aren't having those discussions. Those things have to be pointed out proactively and not reactively. And I think if we do that, and if we can encourage some of our consultants to be more diverse in their hiring, to get more open-minded in terms of who they bring on, people that are really on the ground that can tell you how to win these congressional districts. Because CD7 in Alabama is different than CD2 in Alabama. So you got to understand the dynamics, and you can't come with a sense of what works in North Carolina is going to work in Northwest Florida. Not going to happen. So we've got to make sure that we're getting local people involved, and we're listening to local elected officials, whether it be at the state legislative level, people who have maybe a broader district than most, at the state senate level, being part of that, or even some of our local officials to give us some feedback on how we win these races. Because I think we can win, but we can't win, I can tell you, by playing prevent defense. Prevent defense only prevents you from winning, is what we used to say in sports, in football. You can't win playing, what if they do this? Instead of waiting for them to throw the first punch, we have to throw the first punch. DeSantis is who he is. God bless him. Whoever the next person is in each state of that boogeyman or our opposition, we can't allow ourselves to let them dictate the terms of the debate. We must do that ourselves. We got enough capital to do it. But if we allow that to happen, then we deserve everything we get. We deserve to lose the House, we deserve to lose the Senate, and we deserve to lose even more legislative seats. If not, if we aren't willing to offer a compelling contrast to the stuff that we've seen, certainly whether it be January 6th or any other date, then we can't ask for people to come out and support us and tell their friend and neighbor why they should vote Democrat, and to tell their friend and neighbor why they should be for someone that's running for a congressional seat or a U.S. Senate seat. And that's coming from somebody that's in a blood red state that, for God help us, lest a child molester run again, we don't have a shot at a U.S. Senate seat, because even then, Doug Jones only won by 19,000 votes out of 1.2 million cast. So it's very important to understand where some of us are in some of these states versus where others are, and the real potential to maintain the House and hopefully to get more seats in the Senate to consolidate that influence we want to see the next 2 years of the Biden administration. Sorry for my rant.
No, thanks, Stephen. And I see, Frank, you've got your hands up. I'm going to, though, go to Dane, asked a follow-up question to this. I'm going to pose to you, Mayor, but I'm going to pose it to both you and Matt, asking about messaging, and hearing you that we've got to be different everywhere around the country that we are, but asking about how we speak to people who do hold those multiple jobs, people you talk to. What are those messages that resonate? And I know, Matt, you didn't focus a lot yet on the economic messages that were in the report. So I'd love to have you both, maybe starting with you, Matt, and then see if Stephen wants to chime in on that question.
Well, first of all, Mayor, thank you so much. That was, I agree with basically everything you said, and I would love to hear your answer to the question about how you talk to the folks with multiple jobs. But I will say one thing. While I couldn't agree more that the prevent defense prevents victory, you're right about that. It is also true that you cannot win without some defense. You need offense and you need defense, and you can't win without some degree of both. And I am confident that we're going to have a lot of offense. I've talked to Sean Patrick Maloney, who's running the VCCC. They're going to be pounding Republicans every minute of every day on the unbelievable radicalism of the Trumpian Republican Party. We all know what it is, and they're just going to be pounding them on that. And they need to do that, and we should be doing that constantly. We also need to be, as we've discussed, talking about the incredible work that the Biden Democrats have done for the country that you articulated. Both of those things are vital. There's zero chance we could win without them. But I also think we need a little bit of defense, which is to say, brand identity for these at-risk members so that they can withstand the attacks that Republicans are already bringing. And the attacks can be potent if people don't know who they are. So I think we agree. I just wanted to kind of clarify that point.
Mayor, do you want to take the question about talking to people with multiple jobs and what you have found effective in Montgomery?
Sure, I think that, and I agree with you, man. We do agree. No question about that. I think that what we have to do is, as the saying goes, common sense ain't so common. So we have to put it where the goats can get it. And you have to bring what we're doing here to 2 or 3 basic points to those people in terms of why they should care. And for people who receive rental assistance, for people who received help with the stimulus package, those are things that we can point to. Those are things that help keep the lights on. For people who did not have their landlord evict them, for people who did not have the water authority and others cut off their bills because of that, those are things that we can point to that really make the difference. They may not understand the foreign policy initiatives. They may not understand even some of the environmental concerns that many of us may have. But when you bring it down to the nuts and bolts of what impacts people who are just trying to, stay afloat. I always like to say, there's a political phrase that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I like to say, well, that's only if you have a boat. If you don't have a boat, you drown. So, we have to make sure that we're talking to people in our locations of things that matter to them. If that's schools, if that's healthcare, if those are, again, just basic fundamental needs that have been addressed, I think the simpler, the better. And I think the more repetitive, the better. Because often what, again, the other side does, and I think they do it well, is they get down to 2 or 3 things and they say that over and over again. And that becomes the narrative, right or wrong, like it or dislike it. And I think for us, given that we have a lot of things that help everyday people, we've got to share with them who made that happen. That's not bragging. That's not bragging. That is just connecting the dots for people who don't have a civics course anymore, who don't take government, who don't go to Columbia or Tufts and understand how all these things work. That is just simply connecting the dots to the basic things that impact them and their families. If we do that, then I think then we make a compelling reason for them to go back out and vote for us, and hopefully it'll take 2 or 3 or more people with them when that time comes.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mayor. And I think it goes back to, I couldn't agree with you more. And Matt talked about this earlier about just hammering away on the ARP and this, what this help has done. I mean, I'm talking to leaders in Florida and others who are, we can't forget the cynicism of the other side, who are willing to take full credit for doing this, even though they opposed the plan from the beginning. So I think we cannot emphasize enough and remind people who delivered that for them, and we should not take that for granted. I completely agree with you. We're almost right at time, Frank. I'm going to let you have the last question. You may get a speed round answer to, but I'll let you have the last question.
Okay, so here's my question for Matt. One of the scariest things to me about Trump was that if he said tomorrow the sky was actually purple with blue polka dots, there'd be tens of millions of people that would believe him. And you see in the Senate, in the Congress, the Republicans going along with the big lie. That's, to me, a threat not only to the election, because those are millions of voters, but that's a threat to democracy. Kennedy School's got efforts on disinformation. The president's elevated the role of the science advisor. But what, if anything, is the Democratic Party doing to take on that problem with bastardizing truth and the tens of millions of people that just go along with it?
Frank, that's an easy speed answer question, but go ahead, Matt.
Yes, I will do my best in 30 seconds. It's the point, that is the question at the heart of the Democratic experiment right now. My colleague John Cowan and I had a piece in USA Today recently saying that January 6th, 2025 will be the day that our democracy lives or dies. If the House is controlled by Republicans, and if the Democrat Harris or Biden presumably wins the Electoral College and is not confirmed by the House, our democracy is over. That is the end of the American experiment. And so I couldn't agree more. The risk couldn't be higher. There are a million different ideas for how to deal with misinformation. We're never going to deal with it, to the mayor's point, with the kind of base voter, base Trump voter, the QAnon people are lost to us. But I think that there are plenty of ways of handling misinformation with swing voters and making sure that they are aware of the facts by being smart about how we're using social media, smart about how we're communicating to them. But it's a much longer conversation than we have time for right now. It's a great question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Matt. And thanks for that question, Frank. And this is something that we're going to continue to convene around as well, just because we know that it's of such interest to everyone. So let me just thank you all for being with us. Thank you so much, Matt. Rod, I'll go back to your peanut butter and chocolate analogy from the beginning. We kept our way among our closest collaborators and friends, and we're grateful always to have you and your expertise with us. For everyone else, we will keep you posted about the next program, but really appreciate all of you being with us today. And remember to mark your calendar for November 17th through 19th, when we hope to be back in person finally for our next annual gathering. So please make sure you've got that. Yeah.
Debbie, can I just say one, somebody asked about this presentation that you saw is available on the Third Way website. Actually, it's a longer deck than this that's on our website, thirdway.org. It's pretty easy to find, or you can email me, mbennett@thirdway.org.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And we will make sure that we also circulate that around as well. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to everybody real soon.
Thank y'all.